"I don't think you were meant to be here today," Emily said softly, just loud enough for Margaret to hear as the music swelled and glasses clinked around them, and for a moment, Margaret Collins stood perfectly still near the entrance of the country club ballroom, her gloved hands resting lightly on her purse as if she had simply forgotten why she came. The words settling over her not like a blow but like a quiet confirmation of something she hadn't yet allowed herself to name. Because everything about the evening had already felt slightly off. From the way the valet hesitated before taking her coat to the way the young hostess scanned the guest list twice before forcing a polite smile and waving her inside. And now, standing beneath the soft golden lights with laughter echoing against the high ceilings, she realized that the unease she had dismissed as nerves had been something far more deliberate, something planned. Margaret had spent the morning carefully preparing for this celebration, pressing her navy dress, the one Daniel had once said made her look just like Mom used to at Christmas, brushing her silver hair into place, even choosing a delicate pair of earrings she hadn't worn since before her husband passed, because today mattered. Today was supposed to be a moment where family gathered, where she could feel, even briefly, that she still belonged to something whole, something intact. But as she stepped further into the room, she began to notice the details that didn't quite fit. The seating chart displayed near the bar that listed names in elegant script yet somehow skipped over hers, the way conversations shifted subtly when she approached, the quick glances exchanged between people who offered smiles that never quite reached their eyes, and at the center of it all was Emily, poised and radiant, moving through the crowd with effortless control, greeting guests, adjusting arrangements, guiding the evening as if she alone had orchestrated every moment, which, Margaret realized with a slow tightening in her chest, might not be far from the truth. Daniel stood beside his wife, laughing at something someone said. His posture relaxed, his attention fixed entirely on the life he had built with Emily, and when Margaret caught his eye, just for a second, there was a flicker of something recognition, perhaps, or hesitation, but it passed too quickly to hold on to, replaced by the easy smile he now wore so naturally around everyone else, and Margaret felt it then, not as a sharp pain but as a quiet absence, like stepping into a room where something important had been removed without notice, leaving only space behind. She moved slowly along the edge of the ballroom, observing, noting the patterns, the careful placement of people, the subtle exclusions that could be explained away if questioned but, taken together, formed something undeniable. Because this wasn't an oversight, it wasn't a misunderstanding, it was intention wrapped in politeness, distance disguised as consideration, and as Emily's earlier words echoed again in her mind, Margaret understood with a clarity that settled cold and steady beneath her ribs that she had not simply been forgotten tonight, she had been deliberately, quietly, and very precisely removed. Margaret did not leave immediately because leaving too quickly would have made it visible. And visibility was something she had learned, over the years, to avoid when it came to discomfort, so she moved instead with quiet intention, accepting a glass of water from a passing server, offering polite nods when someone met her eyes, allowing herself to blend into the edges of the room where conversations overlapped and no single voice carried enough weight to demand attention, and from there she watched, not with bitterness but with a kind of careful curiosity, as if the evening itself might explain what had already begun to reveal itself. She noticed how every introduction Emily made carried a subtle framing, how she referred to Daniel as my husband, with a light touch on his arm while speaking of the event as something we put together, never once mentioning Margaret's name, never once acknowledging the woman who had spent decades building the very family now gathered under those soft lights. And it was not what Emily said that unsettled Margaret, but what she chose not to say. The omissions that slowly redrew the boundaries of belonging without ever needing to state them outright. A group near the center of the room laughed as someone raised a toast, and Margaret realized she had not been handed a program, had not been told the order of the evening, had not even known there would be a formal toast, and for a brief moment she considered asking Daniel, just stepping forward, placing a hand lightly on his sleeve the way she used to when he was younger. But the memory of Emily's voice, calm and measured, settled her hesitation before it could turn into action, and instead she remained where she was, observing how naturally everything continued without her, How seamlessly the space adapted to her absence even as she stood within it. She thought back to the weeks leading up to this night, to the brief phone calls, the vague details, the reassurances that everything was taken care of, and she saw them differently now. Not as signs of efficiency but as quiet barriers, small decisions that had gradually moved her further from the center, until there was no center left for her to stand in. And what surprised her most was not the realization itself, but how complete it felt. How thoroughly the shift had been executed without confrontation, without a single raised voice, as if she had been edited out of a story she had once helped write. Across the room, Daniel leaned in to hear something Emily whispered, his expression softening in a way that Margaret recognized but no longer felt connected to. And she understood then that whatever this was, it had not happened tonight, not suddenly, but slowly, carefully, over time, in moments she had overlooked, in silences she had excused, in decisions she had not been invited to question. And as the music swelled again and another round of applause filled the air, Margaret took a small sip of water, her hand steady, her posture unchanged, because there was no need to react yet. Not when the truth was still unfolding. Not when she had only just begun to see the full shape of what had been done. Margaret remained near the edge of the room as the evening continued to unfold, and it was there, in that quiet position just outside the center of attention, that the pattern became impossible to ignore, because the details no longer felt like coincidences but like deliberate placements, each one subtle on its own but unmistakable when seen together. And it started with something small, something that might have passed unnoticed on another day, when a server approached her with a polite smile and asked, "Are you with the catering staff, Mum, or are you a guest?" And for a fraction of a second Margaret simply looked at him, not offended, not even surprised, but thoughtful, as if the question itself confirmed what she had already begun to understand, and she answered gently, "I am family," though even as the words left her mouth, they felt less certain than they once had, because family, she realized, was no longer something defined by history alone but by presence, by acknowledgement, by whether or not others allowed that identity to remain visible. She watched as Emily guided a couple toward their table, her hand lightly extended, her voice warm and controlled, explaining the seating arrangements with the ease of someone who had planned every detail down to the smallest placement, and Margaret's eyes followed the direction of her gesture, noticing how each table carried a card with names printed neatly, carefully grouped, intentionally arranged, and again, she searched for her own, not because she expected to find it this time, but because the absence itself had become a kind of evidence. And when she finally spotted a table near the back with a single empty chair and no name card at all, something in her settled into place. Not anger, not even sadness, but recognition. She moved toward it slowly, her steps measured, and when she reached the chair, she rested her hand briefly against the back as if testing whether it belonged to her, whether this unmarked space was where she had been placed in this carefully constructed evening. And she understood then that this was not an oversight, not a last-minute adjustment, but a decision, one that allowed her to be present without being included, visible without being acknowledged, and it was executed with such precision that no one could easily point to it as unkind, because nothing overt had been done, nothing that could be named without sounding unreasonable, and that was what made it effective. Across the room, Daniel raised his glass as another toast began, his voice joining the others in celebration, and Margaret listened from where she stood, catching fragments of gratitude, mentions of partnership, of future plans, of shared success, all of it framed around a narrative that no longer required her presence to make sense, and she realized that this was the moment she had been approaching all evening, not a confrontation, not a scene, but a quiet understanding that the distance she felt was not imagined, not exaggerated, but constructed, piece by piece, until it became the new reality everyone else seemed comfortable accepting. And as the applause rose again and the music carried the room forward into the next part of the celebration, Margaret allowed herself one steady breath, her expression unchanged, her posture composed, because now she knew, without question, that she had not simply drifted to the edge of her family, she had been guided there, gently, deliberately, and without ever being asked if she wished to follow. Margaret did not sit down at the empty chair because something about it felt too final, too neatly assigned, as if accepting that place would confirm a role she had never agreed to play. So instead she remained standing just behind it, her fingers resting lightly against the polished wood while her eyes moved across the room with a quiet, steady focus, and it was in that stillness that the past began to rearrange itself in her mind, not as distant memories but as pieces of a pattern she could now see with unsettling clarity. Moments that once seemed harmless or easily explained now returning with a sharper edge. Like when Emily had insisted on hosting Thanksgiving 2 years ago, and gently suggested that Margaret take a break this time, assuring her that everything would be handled, only for Margaret to arrive and find that her usual dishes had been replaced, her seat shifted to the far end of the table, her role reduced to that of a guest in a home she had once filled with her own traditions, and at the time, she had smiled, telling herself it was natural for things to change, that younger hands would take over, that this was how families evolved. But standing here now, she saw it differently, saw how each small adjustment had not been about sharing responsibility but about redefining ownership, about quietly moving the center of the family away from her without ever needing to say so. She remembered the Christmas that followed, when Emily had coordinated everything again, sending out schedules and plans that Margaret had not been included in until the last minute. The way Daniel had reassured her that it was just easier this way. His voice calm, almost apologetic, and Margaret had accepted it then, too, because it seemed reasonable, because questioning it would have felt unnecessary. But now she understood that ease had come at a cost, and that cost had been her presence, her voice, her place within the rhythm of her own family. Across the ballroom, Emily laughed at something a guest said, her posture relaxed, her confidence effortless, and Margaret realized that none of this had been rushed or careless, it had been built slowly, carefully, decision by decision, until there was nothing left to question because everything already appeared settled. And what struck Margaret most was not the cruelty of it, but the precision, the way it allowed her to be diminished without ever being openly dismissed, because no one had told her to leave, no one had raised their voice or made a scene, and yet here she was, standing beside a table that bore no name, watching a celebration unfold that no longer required her to feel complete. Daniel lifted his glass again, his smile easy, his attention anchored firmly in the life he now shared with Emily, and Margaret felt the final piece fall into place, not as a sudden realization but as a quiet acceptance of what had already been happening for years, that this was not about a single evening or a single decision, but about a shift that had been carefully guided until it became permanent. And as the music softened and conversations flowed around her, Margaret straightened slightly, her hand leaving the back of the chair, her expression composed, because there was nothing left to question now, only something to understand, and understanding, she knew, was where everything would begin to change. Margaret had just begun to step away from the table when a quiet voice beside her said, "You are not imagining it," and she turned slightly to find Sophie standing there, her posture hesitant but her eyes steady in a way that felt different from the rest of the room, not dismissive, not polite, but aware. And for a brief moment Margaret simply studied her, taking in the way the young woman held herself, as if she had been deciding whether or not to speak for some time and had only just found the courage to do so. And Margaret did not respond immediately because she had learned that silence often revealed more than questions, so she waited, allowing Sophie to continue if she chose. And after a small breath, she did. "She planned all of this," Sophie said quietly, her gaze drifting toward Emily across the room, where she continued to move effortlessly between guests. The guest list, the seating, even who would be introduced and how. It all went through her. And Margaret followed her glance, not with surprise but with confirmation, because the pieces were already there, already aligned, and Sophie's words simply gave them voice. "I thought you knew," Sophie added, almost apologetically, and Margaret gave the slightest shake of her head, not as a denial but as an acknowledgement of something deeper, that knowing and seeing were not always the same, that there were truths one could live beside for years without ever fully recognizing them until a moment like this made them impossible to ignore. Sophie shifted her weight slightly, lowering her voice further. She said it would be better this way, that it would keep things simpler. And the word lingered in the air between them, familiar now, echoing the same reasoning Margaret had heard before, the same gentle justification that had accompanied every quiet adjustment, every small removal, every decision made without her. And Margaret felt something settle more firmly within her. Not resentment, not even hurt, but clarity, the kind that did not demand reaction but instead created space for understanding. She looked back toward the center of the room where Daniel stood beside Emily, listening as someone spoke to him, his expression attentive, his posture relaxed. And Margaret realized that whatever Sophie was revealing, Daniel was already part of it, whether knowingly or not, whether through agreement or simply through silence. And that realization did not come with anger but with a quiet acceptance of how thoroughly things had changed. "Thank you," Margaret said softly, her voice calm, and Sophie nodded, as if relieved that the words had been received without resistance, without dismissal. And for a moment they stood there together, two observers at the edge of a scene that no longer needed explanation, because everything important had already been shown in the spaces between actions, in the choices no one had announced but everyone had followed. Across the room, Emily's laughter rose again, light and controlled, and Margaret allowed herself one final look at the evening as it continued without interruption, without hesitation, as if her presence or absence made no difference at all. And she understood then that this was no longer about being included or excluded from a single event, but about something far more deliberate, something that had been constructed over time and executed with care. And as she turned slightly away from the table, her posture steady, her expression composed, Margaret knew that the moment for quiet observation was coming to an end, and that what followed would require something different, something just as deliberate as what had been done to her, but entirely her own. Margaret stepped away from the table and into the quieter hallway just beyond the ballroom doors, where the sound of laughter softened into a distant hum, and the polished marble floors reflected the warm overhead lights in long, quiet lines. And for the first time that evening, she allowed herself to stop moving, not because she felt overwhelmed, but because she needed a moment to let the clarity settle fully into place without distraction. And she stood there with her hands loosely folded, her breathing even, her thoughts no longer scattered but aligned in a way that felt unfamiliar and steady at the same time, because everything she had observed, everything Sophie had confirmed, had shifted something fundamental inside her, not breaking it, not even shaking it, but refining it, like a lens coming into focus after being slightly off for far too long. She thought about the years behind her, the house she had shared with her husband, the routines they had built, the quiet mornings and the long conversations, and how, after he passed, she had held on to those memories as proof that her place in the family was permanent, unchangeable, something that could not be quietly rewritten. And yet tonight had shown her that permanence was not something others always honored, that it could be adjusted, reframed, and eventually replaced if no one questioned the changes as they happened. And Margaret realized that she had not questioned them, not because she was unaware, but because she had chosen trust over scrutiny, patience over confrontation, believing that time would naturally preserve what mattered. But time, she now understood, had been used differently by someone else. She turned slightly and looked through the glass doors back into the ballroom, where Emily stood at the center of a small group, her gestures confident, her presence unquestioned, and Daniel beside her, listening, nodding, fully aligned with the life that had been carefully structured around him. And Margaret did not feel anger as she watched them, only a quiet recognition that whatever connection had once defined their relationship had been gradually replaced by something else, something that did not require her participation to function. She adjusted the sleeve of her dress gently, a small, precise movement, and in that moment, her reflection in the glass caught her attention, not as a reminder of age or loss, but as a reflection of someone who had been present for every step of this process and was now finally choosing to see it clearly. And that realization did not weaken her. It steadied her, because understanding, she knew, was not an ending. It was a beginning, the first step in deciding what would come next. Behind her, the hallway remained quiet, undisturbed, and Margaret allowed herself one final breath in that stillness before straightening her posture slightly and turning back toward the doors, not to return as she had been before, not as someone waiting to be included, but as someone who now understood the structure she was standing within, and more importantly, her ability to step beyond it when the time came, because whatever had been arranged tonight had been done with care and intention, and if she chose to respond, it would require the same. Not louder, not harsher, but just as deliberate, just as precise, and entirely on her terms. Margaret returned to the ballroom with the same measured pace she had carried all evening, but something in her presence had shifted in a way that no one else could quite name, because she no longer moved as someone trying to find her place within the room. She moved as someone who had already understood that the place being offered was not the one she would accept. And that quiet certainty settled into her posture, into the way her shoulders aligned and her gaze steadied, as she stepped back into the flow of conversation and light without, announcing her return, without drawing attention, yet somehow no longer blending into the edges as she had before. She noticed immediately how little changed in her absence, how seamlessly the evening had continued, as if she had simply stepped out for air and nothing more. And that realization, rather than stinging, confirmed the final layer of what she had already come to understand, that her role here had not been diminished in a moment but dissolved over time, replaced so gradually that its absence now felt natural to everyone else in the room. Emily glanced in her direction briefly, her expression composed, offering a small, polite smile that carried no recognition beyond courtesy. And Margaret returned it with the same calm restraint, because there was no longer anything to confront in that exchange, nothing to question, only something to acknowledge silently, the precision of it, the way it had been executed without fracture, without visible conflict, leaving nothing behind that could be easily challenged. Daniel was engaged in conversation with a group near the center, his voice animated, his gestures relaxed. And when his eyes passed over Margaret, there was no pause, no sift, no sign that he noticed anything different, and that, more than anything else, settled the truth firmly into place, not as a wound but as a conclusion, because absence, she realized, did not always require distance. Sometimes it existed fully within the same room, within the same moment, unseen and unquestioned. Margaret moved toward the bar and set her empty glass down with a soft, deliberate motion, her reflection briefly visible in the polished surface behind it, and she regarded it not as a reminder of what had been lost, but as a clear image of who remained, someone who had watched, understood, and now stood at the point where observation would no longer be enough, because clarity, once reached, carried with it a quiet responsibility. Not to react impulsively, not to reclaim what had already been redefined, but to decide what would come next with the same level of care that had shaped everything she had just witnessed. The music shifted again, softer now, signaling a transition in the evening, and Margaret recognized the rhythm of it, the planned progression, the way each part of the event led naturally into the next without interruption, and she understood that this too had been designed, that nothing here was accidental, that every detail served a purpose within a structure she had only just fully seen, and as she stood there, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her gaze steady, Margaret allowed that understanding to settle completely, not as something that demanded immediate action, but as something that would guide it when the moment arrived. As she knew now, with a certainty that left no room for doubt, that whatever had been done to place her at the edge of this room had been intentional, and that whatever she chose to do next would need to be just as intentional, just as quiet, and far more final. Margaret did not stay much longer after that because there was nothing left for her to observe that she had not already understood, and leaving did not feel like retreat but like completion, like stepping away from something that had revealed itself fully without needing further confirmation. So she set her empty glass down with the same quiet precision she had carried throughout the evening and moved toward the exit without announcing her departure, without searching for Daniel, without offering explanations that would have only served to reopen something she had already closed within herself. And as she passed through the ballroom one last time, she noticed how easily the space continued to move around her, conversations flowing, laughter rising and falling, the evening unfolding exactly as it had been designed to, untouched by her presence or her absence, and that, more than anything, affirmed her decision, because it showed her clearly that nothing here required her to remain. The cool night air outside met her with a calm stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if the world beyond those doors existed on a different rhythm entirely, one that did not depend on curated moments or controlled perceptions. And Margaret paused briefly at the top of the steps, looking out across the quiet parking lot where rows of cars sat under soft overhead lights, each one belonging to someone inside who believed they were part of something complete, something whole. And she wondered, not with bitterness but with clarity, how many of them would notice if one piece of that completeness quietly disappeared. She walked toward her car at a steady pace, the sound of her heels measured against the pavement, and with each step, the noise of the evening faded further behind her until it became nothing more than a distant echo. And in that silence, her thoughts did not race or circle. They settled, forming into something structured, something intentional, because understanding alone was never the end of a story. It was the beginning of a decision, and Margaret knew now that whatever came next would not be shaped by emotion or reaction, but by the same careful precision she had witnessed all evening. She reached her car and paused for a moment before unlocking it, her hand resting lightly against the handle as she looked at her reflection in the darkened window. And she saw not someone excluded, not someone diminished, but someone who had finally seen the full design of what had been done, and more importantly, someone who now understood her own ability to respond without needing to raise her voice or demand recognition, because the most significant changes, she had learned, were rarely the loudest ones. They were the quiet decisions made after everything else had already been revealed. When she finally opened the door and settled into the driver's seat, she did not rush to start the engine. She simply sat for a moment in the stillness, her hands resting calmly in her lap, her posture composed, as if marking the transition from one chapter to the next. And as the soft glow of the dashboard lights illuminated the interior, Margaret allowed herself one final breath before turning the key, not as someone leaving something behind, but as someone moving forward with a clarity that would shape everything that followed. Because whatever had been taken from her had been done quietly, and whatever she chose to do next would be done the same way, only this time, it would be entirely under her control. The next morning arrived without urgency, the pale light of early day stretching quietly across Margaret's kitchen as she moved through her routine with the same measured calm she had carried the night before, setting a kettle on the stove, placing a single cup on the counter, the familiar rhythm grounding her not in habit, but in clarity, because nothing in her felt unsettled anymore, nothing uncertain. And as the soft sound of water beginning to heat filled the room, she reached for the small wooden box she kept in the cabinet above the refrigerator, the one she had not opened in years, and placed it carefully on the table, her fingers resting on its lid for a moment before lifting it with deliberate ease, revealing a collection of documents neatly arranged, papers that had once felt distant, unnecessary, something to be handled later, but now carried a quiet significance that required no delay. She sat down and began to review them one by one, her eyes steady, her movements precise, not searching for answers but confirming decisions she had already made. And there was no hesitation in her as she reached for the phone beside her, dialing a number she remembered without effort, waiting calmly as it rang. And when the voice on the other end answered, she spoke clearly, her tone even, as if this had been planned long before the previous evening, arranging a meeting, requesting a review, making changes that required no explanation beyond her own understanding of what was necessary. Outside, the world moved as it always did, cars passing, distant sounds of neighbors beginning their day, and inside, Margaret continued her work without interruption, each step aligning with the quiet intention that had formed the moment she chose to see things as they truly were. Later that afternoon, she sat across from a man in a well-lit office, the documents laid out between them, her posture composed, her voice steady as she outlined her decisions with a clarity that left no room for doubt, adjusting details that would shift the future in ways no one else had anticipated, not out of spite, not out of anger, but out of a simple, undeniable truth that she no longer needed to hold space for those who had already chosen to redefine her place without her consent. The man nodded, making notes, asking brief questions, each one met with precise answers, and when it was done, Margaret gathered her things without ceremony, standing with the same quiet confidence she had carried into the room, because nothing about this moment required recognition, nothing needed to be witnessed beyond its completion. Days later, when the evening of the celebration had already settled into memory for everyone else as a successful event, a pleasant gathering, a moment of shared joy, the consequences of that night began to unfold in ways no one had prepared for, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the same quiet precision that had defined everything Margaret chose to do. And in the center of it all, she remained exactly as she had been when she walked out into the night air, composed, steady, and entirely in control of what came next.